Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest.
You have not earned your place as Secretary of Defense. You say you care about keeping our armed forces strong and that you like that our armed forces are meritocracy, then let's not lower the standards for you.
January 16th, 2025, the Every Single One Will Be Confirmed edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C. From New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School in New Haven, Connecticut, Emily Bazelon. Hello, Emily.
Hey, David.
And it's the last week before the Trump presidency, but it's the next to last week before John Dickerson becomes co-anchor of CBS Evening News from New York City, where he's like, I can't even imagine how busy he is. Mr. John Dickerson, hello.
Hi. Indeed, I am busy, but nothing more joyous than seeing you two in these little Hollywood squares. You know, by the way, Hollywood Squares.
Are you now going to host Hollywood? Are you going to be on Hollywood Squares? Yeah. Is that part of your job?
I'm going to make all of those. I'm only sort of 70s risque jokes that are obviously no longer risque.
I can't even think of what they would be. I've forgotten all those jokes. All right. I'm sure you have them all in your head. This week on the Gabfest, the confirmation hearings, particularly the brief and underwhelming but disturbing confirmation hearing for Defense Secretary, soon-to-be Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and what these hearings signal about the pliant Republican Senate. Then Jack Smith releases his wan final report about Trump's election subversion. What have we learned from his report and from his investigation? Then President Biden gave his farewell address to the nation. We'll talk about his legacy. We'll talk a little bit about his speech, whether it will stand the test of time, but mostly we'll talk about how he'll be remembered. Plus, we will have cocktail chatter. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations. If there were a shoe to eat, I would eat it. I was absolutely certain that Pete Hegseth was a dead nominee walking when that cascade of revelations about his personal failings and professional failings, alcoholism, racist chants, financial mismanagement, and most of all, sexual predation came out last month. But I underestimated the power of Trumpist forces to bully and compel Republican senators, even the ones who know better, because we know that a lot of them know better, into line, and the willingness of most of them to endorse someone who is historically unqualified for the job and unsuitable for the position. So we have advice and consent, which has been reduced to consent or maybe to obey. So, Emily, let's start with you. What did you make of the rather attenuated Hegseth confirmation hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee on, I guess it was on Tuesday, and the charade of an FBI investigation that preceded it?
Well, I was also totally surprised. I try not to make predictions. I did not think Hegseth would be confirmed because of the reports of how much drinking he was doing. I just figured, like, even if you decided to set aside the allegations of sexual assault, which, you know, in fairness, still remain anonymous, or at least we haven't directly heard from the accuser, plus there were no criminal charges. Okay, fine. The mismanagement of the little organizations he ran, distressing. But, you know, mostly anonymous accusations. But the drunkenness, I just didn't think that the Senate would want a lush to be the Secretary of Defense. It's like, seems like a big, important job where you would care about that. And during the hearings, I was struck by how much the Democrats seemed distracted by, like, the fact that Hegseth has had affairs. There was some focus on the alcohol use, but that seemed to be like they weren't making as big a deal of that as I would have imagined. And then also, I think not enough attention to how little experience he has and just trying to show his lack of knowledge about various important areas. It seemed pretty low on substance. John, am I being a little unfair because I'm going by news reports? I didn't watch it all.
The strongest argument, I think you're right, Emily. I mean, even the Wall Street Journal editorial page said, it appears we're on track to have a Secretary of Defense whose real views are a mystery. Let's hope he rises to the occasion. This was an evaluation of the Senate confirmation hearing. The strongest argument the Republicans made in support of him was that he is somebody who served with distinction. And so there were questions about, everything from how many push-ups he did to what kind of batteries he put in his night vision goggles to elevate his experience as a...
Were there really? Wait, that was literally a question?
Yeah.
How many push-ups can you do?
I did 5 sets of 47 this morning.
What do you think are most important strategic bases in the Pacific?
In the Pacific, Guam is pretty strategically significant.
How many rounds of 5.56 can you fit into the magazine of an M4 rifle?
Depends on the magazine, but standard issue is 30. Senator.
And what size round does the M9 Beretta standard issue sidearm for the military fire?
A 9mm, Senator.
What kind of batteries do you put in your night vision goggle?
Duracell.
This is, I'm speaking now purely about the theater of hearings. And so that's an argument that is probably the best one you can make. But I mean, it's not like Pete Hegseth is the only human on the planet who has served in the military. And the leadership qualities that you mentioned, Emily, are crucial. It's an enormous job with complex questions, puzzles that have to be fixed. Also, it's a job that's not just about warfighting, it's about diplomacy. What is it in his background that shows he's got any interest or aptitude for that? Again, the Wall Street Journal basically said Republicans didn't care to ask him about any of the serious questions in front of the Secretary of Defense. And then finally, I would just say, one of the arguments also put forward for him is by Republicans, we've had people who had experience. Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, look where that got us, which is also not a bad argument to make for a Republican Party that has now completely abandoned George W. Bush and the war on terror. But the thing is, if you're coming in to reorganize everything and you've got a big agenda for getting out the wokeness and all this other stuff, that requires somebody with management skill and talent for executing things too. And that's just not in evidence in his background. So even for the things that the Trump world wants done, he shows no aptitude and wasn't questioned about whether he has any aptitude to get those things done.
I thought David Brooks made a good point in a New York Times op-ed where he said, Hegseth, we deserve this, because if you have a Senate that is so supine in its responsibilities about advising and consenting, and is so, we have Ukraine, China, Russia, Gaza, Afghanistan. There is no shortage, Syria, no shortage of incredibly important topics that the defense secretary is going to deal with, and complex issues. And to have, for the Senate to schedule such a brief, terse hearing about this, A, and B, for the questions to be so pathetic and to ignore all these issues suggests that, we have an unserious Senate, and we will get ourselves an unserious Secretary of Defense he will make war on our enemies. He will make a culture war on our enemies, which are wokeness and DEI, and we will conquer the kingdom of woke in this administration. What we do about China or Russia or Ukraine, who can say?
I mean, it really feels like a huge experiment that we're about to run, of having someone this inexperienced in management, in policy, in thought, in charge of such an important part of the American government. It's making me wonder, can you just sideline the Pentagon? I don't know.
Can I ask you guys, one of the things that really grabbed me, which I hadn't really thought about, was, so one of the worries about having somebody like Hegseth, who has this sort of checkered personal history, and this history with alcohol, is the risk of blackmail, the risk that he will, because he has all these vulnerable failings, he will be susceptible to some foreign power demanding something from him because he's fear of being embarrassed. And someone pointed out, he literally was blackmailed.
He said that. He said I paid off my accuser because I didn't know what else to do, basically.
Yeah. It was like, oh yeah, I mean, did you guys feel like that is a disqualification, or actually no? I mean, it doesn't really. A, we shouldn't worry too much about blackmail, and B, anyone in that circumstance would have done the same or something like that.
I mean, the fact that he's promising never to drink while he's Secretary of Defense and may not, frankly, be capable, or like that could be a very hard promise for him to keep. Let's put it that way, because presumably he's not going to be able to go into rehab if that would need to happen. And he's going to be under a lot of pressure. I wondered if that was going to open a front into what you're talking about. I mean, it is a little conspiracy minded to go down this path too far, but it does, I don't know, it just, the idea that you could have those kinds of vulnerabilities just seems on its face problematic.
I think you're right, Emily. This is an enormous experiment based on theories that are not proved. In other words, that a person who has no experience totally reorganizing a supermassive and complex organization that has resisted reorganization is suddenly going to grow the skills and talents to be able to do that. I would, on the blackmail front, blackmail relies on shame and pressure and norms from your own side. And I think the argument you were making, David, is, and both of you were making, is that this seemed like a nomination that would fall as Matt Gaetz's did because political gravity would reassert itself. I think you can make a case that, in fact, Hegseth's personal challenges were in a way, and I don't want to go too far and people don't mishear me, were in a way a help to his campaign because he fought back hard, which we know has been something that Donald Trump in his history has approved of. Brett Kavanaugh fighting back for his political life, we know from reporting, kept Trump from abandoning Kavanaugh. We've seen in other instances when somebody has fought back, Trump likes that, sees himself in that, approves of that. Once Donald Trump approves of that, then it becomes necessary for Republicans who are anxious to stay in Trump's good graces to then support the person that Trump continues to support and back. And so that public demonstration of toughness and loyalty to Trump end up probably getting him through this in a fashion. Don't want to go too far, but that feels like it's probably true.
Being able to say that perfectly valid, very likely true criticism is a smear campaign and positioning oneself as the target of, especially, I think, sexual assault or misconduct accusations has become a kind of asset because a bunch of people, including Trump, in Trump world, have experienced this. And so the truth of the matter just gets flung aside in favor of a lot of chest beating about how terrible an injustice one is suffering. And I just want to say, there were questions about why the woman who accused Hegseth didn't come forward. I mean, really? Like, of course she didn't come forward. Her life would be completely ruined. Look what happened to Christine Blasey Ford. This is an incredibly unforgiving environment for coming out publicly with such statements. And there is a success in the bullying and the intimidation tactics, which is really troubling for this nomination, but also just like going forward as a feature of American political life.
One tiny thing on this notion of leadership based on your performance in battle. I mean, obviously that's been raised as an asset before with previous secretaries of defense, Mattis, Esper, Lloyd Austin. So it's not like this is the only person who's ever had those qualities, but I was reminded of something that Eisenhower said about Patton, because I think this is an important, because one of the experiments we're running here is whether personal experience trumps everything else in this narrow way. And Eisenhower said Patton's strength is that he thinks only in terms of attack. The man has a native shrewdness. Personally, I doubt that I would ever consider Patton for an Army group commander or any high position. But under a man who is sound and solid and who has enough sense to use Patton's good qualities without becoming blinded by his love of showmanship and histrionics. So what Eisenhower is saying in the abstract is Patton, killer on the battlefield, not so good as a commander. And that's, the question at play here. Whereas the Republicans who were defending Hegseth were saying essentially, good war fighter, all other questions need to be put aside as a result of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be a fascinating test. My theory, having been a CEO now for 10 years, not of the Department of Defense and not of particularly, large or notably multinational companies or anything like that, but just having to manage a lot of people, is project management is basically everything. That if you want to run something successfully, it is everyone has ideas, everyone has energy. It is really a question of like deploying resources, staging it in the correct time and correct order. And that if you want to actually accomplish something, that's what you need. I think this Trump administration is going to be a test, or at least the Department of Defense, it will be a test of an alternative theory. we'll see. I mean, why do you think, John? Why do you think they chose Hegseth as a nominee to play hardball with? Like they could have flung him. They could have hung him out to dry. They could have dumped him along with when they dumped Gates, and they could have brought in somebody else who would have had a lot of the same qualities, but probably not the same personal failings. But they didn't, and they pushed a bunch of senators who, and you know that Susan Collins and probably Joni Ernst and a lot of the other Marco Rubio, like they don't think this guy is particularly qualified for the job, but they're going to vote for him anyway because they fear the alternative. Why did they choose him, and how did they get away with it so easily?
Well, I think the Trump's support for him and his continued support for him is important. I think Trump kind of backed off Gates a little bit. Gates also had that ethics complaint in the wings, which was more damning, maybe, I think probably, than the Hegseth thing.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned the pressure put on Joni Ernst, Republican senator from Iowa, who is herself a veteran. That's another way in which the Hegseth nomination and his troubles is in fact a kind of benefit, which is to say that it was a shape-up cruise for all the exterior forces that ramped up and put the pressure on. So now everybody's in sort of fighting trim to enforce what Donald Trump would like on those lawmakers in the House and Senate who might have questions. So in the end, I guess really it comes down for me to Trump, and also it would have been a public, it's not just what he wants, it would have been a public rebuke of Trump on a high profile candidate. And I don't think anybody had the personal, desire to jump and do that. And get the hell that would have come their way. Also successfully framed by Hegseth and the White House as a smear campaign from the left. That these weren't legitimate questions. These were just an effort of the woke world to try to stop him, and that's the very world he's trying to undo at the Pentagon.
Moving on from Hegseth, was there anything remarkable, Emily, in the other confirmation hearings that you paid attention to? We had Marco Rubio, we had Pam Bondi, who you probably noted something about. We had CIA Director John Ratcliffe, the Secretary of Energy, who said that climate change was not contributing to wildfire growth, which is an interesting position to have. Anything else jump out at you?
I mean, I was paying attention to the Bondi hearing, and the Democrats were trying to press her on her independence from Trump. I don't really, she said the obvious, like, of course you say in the moment, I'm going to make my own decisions about who to prosecute. But I didn't see anything that, substantively seemed particularly reassuring. She was super critical of the current Department of Justice, said it had, totally run amok and was out of control, and she was going to come in and fix it. And of course, that is a real flip of the idea of accountability. And then she also talked about the pardons for the January 6th defendants. She got out, I would say, a little over her skis because the pardons are not up to her. And she did say that she thought Trump would not pardon people who'd actually physically attacked police officers. But that leaves a lot of room for a lot of other people. And one just generally got the feeling that like she was exactly what Trump ordered.
I was really heartened to hear she does not have an enemies list. Like, that was very heartening.
Cash Patelis is long enough to cover both of them.
It really made me wonder, though, actually, this is a historical question, which I'm sure only John has the answer to, which is when Nixon had an enemies list, did they call it enemies list? Did they write like enemies list at the top of it? Or was it just like a list of people who are on our bad side? Because I think calling it an enemies list is a little too on the nose.
Seems very Nixonian. It's an informal name is the answer to this, David. It comes in quotation marks.
I thought it was like the Malaise speech. It got the name after and wasn't actually named.
Right. Well, it was officially called the Opponents List and Political Enemies Project.
Oh,
okay. It was identifying and tracking his major political opponents.
Yeah, a spade.
Exactly.
Wow. I was just about to say, I think there was some kind of internal name, but that's pretty darn close to enemies list.
On Saturday, we are posting an episode of Gabfest Reads, our monthly book segment. It's an interview I did with Yael van der Wouden, who is the author of the really interesting, haunting new novel, The Safekeep. And I had a great time talking to Yael. So look for it in your feed.
Thunderwouden is an all-time name.
It means in the woods in Dutch.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by GiveWell. GiveWell, a nonprofit that researches and recommends giving opportunities, is committed to maximizing the impact of donations. Each recommendation is grounded in months of rigorous research and transparency to ensure your contribution has the greatest possible impact on the world. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they found. And over 125,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that those donations will save over 200,000 lives. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving, which is why you can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. And when you make a tax-deductible donation to their recommended funds or charities, GiveWell doesn't take a cut. So go to givewell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcast and enter Political Gabfest at checkout to make sure they know you heard about them from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. This episode is brought to you by Lumen. Your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does. So optimizing your metabolic health translates to easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and better sleep. If you're ready to jumpstart your health in 2025, Lumen can help. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath and gives you recommendations to improve your metabolic health. So you breathe into your Lumen device first thing in the morning, and the app lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs. And then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for the day based on your measurements. If you breathe into it before or after workouts and meals, you'll know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Take the next step to improving your health. Go to lumen.me/Gabfest to get 20% off your Lumen. That is lumen.me/Gabfest for 20% off your purchase. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. Jack Smith's report on Trump's election subversion activities was released shortly after Smith himself resigned as special counsel. The report explained why Smith believed Trump was guilty of crimes and would have been convicted, why he didn't charge Trump with insurrection, and why everything took so long. I mean, if there was ever a whimper, not a bang exit, this is it. We talked last week about the sort of wind down of the Trump legal woes, which were not woes at all, which ended up being triumphs for him. But this is the final word that we'll hear from the man who was primarily charged with prosecuting a federal case against Trump. Emily, what was interesting to you in Smith's report, if anything?
I mean, I was interested in why he didn't charge insurrection. The answer to that had to do with the fact that there was almost no precedent for insurrection cases since the Reconstruction era in the 19th century. The definition of insurrection, it wasn't totally clear that it included trying to hang on to power as a trying to, knock down the government from the outside. And so that seemed like a perfectly fine choice. I think what Smith was trying to do is explain all the steps he'd taken and why there'd been so many delays and tribulations along the way, as opposed to providing new information. It's possible there is more new information in the other volume of this report about the Mar-a-Lago documents case, which we are not seeing, maybe ever. We'll see. And I have such mixed feelings about this whole prosecution. Smith was justifying it. He was saying, look, for the sake of the even-handed administration of justice and other, ideas about just like rule of law, that once he started investigating Trump, he had to keep going. And that led inevitably to these charges. And I get that. I mean, you have, 1,500 people being charged January 6th. How do you not have the person who the prosecutors conclude is the ringleader being prosecuted? At the same time, I do think this prosecution in its kind of collapse, largely because of the Supreme Court's immunity decision, but other factors too, it is leaving the legal system weaker in terms of challenging or standing up for, separation of powers and making sure an authoritarian president doesn't wreck the system in some way coming up. And that just seems like extremely bad timing. And so in retrospect, one wonders, this is an idea you had months ago, I think, David, like, would it have been better for Biden to offer Trump a pardon? Because that would have said, okay, we see something wrong here, but we're not going to try to take it through the court process. And that would have taken a lot of forethought that wasn't going to work. And it would have been politically, among Democrats, I think, viewed as like completely out of bounds. But we've just ended up in a bad place.
Don't you have a coordination problem too? So picking up on what you're saying, Emily, you probably could also add in that the Senate didn't impeach Trump for this, maybe in part because, or perhaps largely because, Republicans who might otherwise have voted to impeach him thought he was dead as a political force. Anyway, I mean, you forget that when he left Washington, almost nobody went to Andrews Air Force Base to see him off. And when you think about the adulation now being ladled on Trump as he prepares to enter a second term, not just from his own party, but from Mark Zuckerberg and others. But back then, if the impeachment process had gone the way it might have, given what Republican senators felt in their heart of hearts, that would have taken care of this in another way too. It didn't. But the coordination problem I'm thinking about is the Biden pardon that you mentioned, Emily, which is interesting, would have required Merrick Garland not to go forward, right? And would have required basically Biden and Garland to coordinate.
Yeah, that doesn't seem so difficult. I mean, first of all, the presidential pardon power is just the president's, absolutely. Biden could have just been like, you know what, I don't care what you're doing, Merrick Garland. Like, I'm pardoning.
But imagine really, like, Garland says, we're going to investigate, and then Biden says, no, I'm going to pardon, like, right away. Like, is that plausible?
Yeah, I mean, that's plausible. Sure. Yeah. Also, Garland wasn't exactly, like, eager, right? I mean, he basically had to be sort of dragged into this by the congressional investigation of January 6th. It's not like, right? It took Garland and he was also looking for other things, like more obvious crimes, not connected to Trump's presidency, to go after financial impropriety. Anyway, I don't. That feels to me like a surmountable problem. I think the politics would have been impossible because it's really only in hindsight and where we know how this case ended up. It wasn't foreseeable enough at the time, I think.
I mean, this is one of the really interesting questions that historians will look back at, which is, knowing what we know now, of course, it was obviously whatever happened was the wrong choice because the Supreme Court has, created this terrible precedent. They've cleared this president of any crimes. The politicization of justice is like now sort of legitimately on the table. Judges have seen the value of sucking up to this particular president, so that you have the behavior of Aileen Cannon is so disturbing in this way. The insurrectionist, anti-constitutional forces of the Republican Party are stronger than ever. Trump is obviously stronger than. So in all ways, it worked out badly. The rule of law is weaker than ever. So we know it was the wrong choice, but like it is standing in 2021 on January, late January 2021, is it clear what should happen next? And is it clear how people should behave? The moral failing absolutely belongs with Republican senators who did not convict Trump in 2021 and clear him out of the political system. Like that part is they were clearly wrong and we pay the price for it. Whether Jack Smith, Merrick Garland, Joe Biden deserve blame for misapprehending how it would turn out, I don't know. Like, I don't think their choices were good choices. None of them were good choices, and it turned out on the worst possible way.
Remember also that Mitch McConnell and maybe others, but him, said, well, if we don't impeach him, that's okay because there's still the legal system outside of the impeachment process that he'll be subject to, which allows him to to defend his impeachment decision. But at least publicly, you had Republicans arguing that there was a non-political way to go after Trump. Can I just say one quick thing on that insurrection question, Emily? What interested me about the report was it just focused me back again on the way in which Trump speaks. That essentially, the way Smith wrote about it, it was an elaborate version of "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?"
Yeah, my boss.
What struck me when I read it was you have a situation in which Trump's highly idiosyncratic way of communicating makes no sense to people who are not familiar with what he's saying. And his supporters say, well, that's just because you're out of touch. He has this incredible bond with his supporters that is almost extra communicative. He communicates in this thorough way that normal humans might not understand, but that is just the key to his support. But then when it comes to the assertion that exact kind of communication is what sent them to attack the Capitol, defenders then get Jesuitical in splicing individual words and say, well, that's not what he meant at all. He said peaceful protest and he didn't use the word. And all of a sudden, so you have this having it both ways, I was reminded of, which isn't just about the past. It's about what he's going to do as president when he says things and how seriously to take him when he says something.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Smith said, we thought that the violence was foreseeable, that he knew that, and then obviously didn't stop it. And Smith thought that was going to get over the barrier the First Amendment poses to bringing an attempt to incite charge. But then he said, well, we decided it wasn't clear that Trump knew that he was setting up the full scope of the violence, which is a perfect illustration of the point you were making, John. I don't understand, legally speaking, why they felt like they had to prove the full scope. But in any case, that is part of the thinking here. I want to say one more thing about the prosecutors, which is, I think, yes, there are questions to ask about everyone's role. On the other hand, when you are the team of prosecutors, when you are Jack Smith and the people working with him, and your job is to investigate and decide, is there a crime here? That's a different role in the system from all the other people who should have political consequences and considerations very much at heart, including, I would put Merrick Garland in the strategy, politics, as well as law category. But Jack Smith himself and those lawyers, they had a particular job. And I think that's why what does kind of resonate in this report is the justification for this idea of even-handed administration of justice and that these prosecutors had to do their job.
How much do you think the overall system of justice at the federal level is going to be affected by how badly this went? Do you think regular day-to-day prosecutions are going to be at all different? Do you think the administration of justice is going to be at all different? Do you think judges in regular everyday cases are going to behave differently? Or is it only going to be in the very special cases which involve a friend of the president, a company that's, at the heart of the president's activity, someplace where Trump himself really has a personal interest that justice will be corrupted?
That just totally depends on what happens next, because once you have that kind of rot in the system, and that really is a form of corruption, even if it's indirect, it's not going to stay small, right? It might start small, but then it keeps going because the whole incentive scheme has shifted and people see those kinds of particular benefits based on connections, and that warps their behavior. And then, judges and prosecutors and FBI agents respond as well. So I think that is very much in the lap of Pam Bondi.
What does it tell us, if anything, about the number of convictions and plea deals and other legal cases that have come forward related to trying to overthrow the election? I'm thinking about the fake electors that were convicted or indicted, I should say, in Michigan. There's in Arizona. We don't know what's going on exactly at the moment in Georgia. I guess it's on pause. But then there's the pleas from Kenneth Chesebro. The rest of the legal system, and then, of course, obviously all the people who've been convicted who were actually at the Capitol on January 6th, the rest of the legal system seems to be able to process this event, in the very opposite way. Basically, Trump seems to be the only one who's skating on this.
Well, I mean, they're the people who might get the pardons. But actually, I mean, I'm glad you raised that, John, because one of the interesting thing here is that Smith is really laying the blame for the false elector scheme on Trump and these unnamed conspirators who include like John Eastman, et cetera, Rudy Giuliani. And so that is a defense to the other people, right? Like the idea that they were duped, that they were being told, oh, we're only going to use this slate you've put together if the election, post like some election overturning. It's not going to be the tool that is used to do that. I mean, Smith is basically feeding into that narrative of other people's involvement. And so people who haven't been convicted yet have a nice new defense. I mean, obviously the charges, I think, against them will be dropped to the extent that those are federal charges under Bondi's control. But this is going to come up in state court with the Michigan false electors for sure. And the people who already pled guilty may be kind of ruining the day that they tried to quickly address their cases as opposed to waiting it out for this, turn of events.
Well, also there's some state cases and those guys are just in the position they're in. There's no pardon power that can affect them. Yeah,
true. I mean, the state cases under state law, this is the one of the good things about our federalist system is that there are different kinds of accountability.
And we should note also there are civil cases that are out there bouncing around that do directly accuse Trump of inciting the mob.
Yeah, which are in trouble, I would say, based on the immunity ruling mostly. But we'll see. You're right. There are still civil liability cases in federal court against him brought by people who were injured in January 6th, like the Capitol Police.
But those can't proceed, right?
Well,
civil cases against the president are not allowed to proceed.
Well,
I thought civil cases are sort of suspended for the length of the presidency.
Until they get out of the presidency.
There is a Supreme Court ruling that, yes, there is one about that, but there's a question about whether they get suspended or just dismissed entirely. How does the Supreme Court's immunity ruling on criminal liability factor into those cases? There was a hearing about that like a couple weeks ago.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Quince. It's a new year, a new opportunity for us to reimagine ourselves. And more importantly, our wardrobes. This year, you can refresh your look with quality pieces and stay on budget with Quince. I am sitting here wearing a Quince performance polo. Love my Quince performance polos. I have a bunch of them. They are incredibly comfortable. They fit beautifully. They look really good. I love their cashmere sweaters. Quince has something for everyone. But however you choose to refresh your look this year, all Quince pieces are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. And they can do that by partnering directly with top factories, cutting out the cost of the middleman, and passing the savings on to you. So upgrade your closet this year without the upgraded price tag. Go to quince.com/gabfest for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/gabfest to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/gabfest. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Mint Mobile. 2025 is here. And Mint Mobile has a resolution for you. Skip the gym, skip the fad diets, and skip the BS resolutions you'll forget about by next month. Instead, make a resolution to save some serious cash by switching to Mint Mobile. Right now, you can get half off their 3-month unlimited plan. Even Slate's president, Charlie Kammerer, is using Mint Mobile. And Charlie says more people should be trying Mint out. It was really easy for him to switch providers. The SIM card was shipped to his home. They let him use his existing phone. He didn't have to change his phone number. And he's on the $15 a month deal and is getting unlimited talk and text over their 5G network at literally a fraction of what he was paying with someone else. Switch to Mint and new customers can get half off an unlimited plan until February 2nd. To get your new wireless plan for just $15 a month and get the plan shipped to your door for free, go to mintmobile.com/gabfest. That's mintmobile.com/gabfest. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. President Biden made his farewell speech on Wednesday night. I'm not sure he thinks of it as a farewell speech. He insists he's going to stay involved in Democratic Party politics. Good luck with that, Joe. But it capped a long and really noble career in politics. He worked hard for the country. He sacrificed a huge amount for the country. He obviously had enormous personal tragedies while serving in office. And he served with dignity and with honesty and with ambition. And, as a citizen, I'm grateful to him for all that he's done. I think politics is a noble profession when carried out in certain ways. And I think he carried out in a noble way. And he will end as a tragic figure, however, even though by most measures, the United States economy was way stronger than other developed nations in the Biden administration. It made a much stronger comeback from the pandemic. It got past inflation faster than other countries. It built up its industrial capacity. It made some smart investments in infrastructure. Yet he leaves hugely unpopular. His presidency largely seen as a failure by voters. And of course, it was preceded and now succeeded by somebody who threatens the very system that Biden has been so adamant about representing and advancing. So I guess my first question is, when it comes to his unpopularity, John, who was right, voters or your lying eyes?
Voters, have the last word. So in a sense, they are all that matters. But on the other hand, the electorate is not the location of all wisdom. Also, the electorate is out of sync with the job of the presidency, which is, sorry for you guys who are in the presidency. That's one of the big sad things about it. I mean, even George W. Bush, who was a clearer case about how poorly the war in Iraq had gone, how poorly Afghanistan was going when he left office. There are things that he did as president on AIDS in Africa, on preparing a pandemic preparedness plan that were very much under the radar, but that are nevertheless a part of his presidency. This is not to defend the W's presidency. It's just to say that there are long-term things that a president does that are just not a part of the conversation. And so in Biden's case, there are a number of things like that in history's time, he might get credit for. He might also get blamed by history, but that timeline is different than the voters' timeline. So all the work on the infrastructure bill is going to benefit some other generation than the one, not other generation, but is going to benefit people outside of the timeline of this election. That's also true with climate change and the work that he did, both in the legislation he passed, but also in what his EPA did. You could imagine a way in which 30 years from now, the actions he took, especially bookended by the Trump administrations, when climate change has and the effects of it have raged even further, his presidency might look different by history's light. So I think both can be true. And also look at COVID, his response to COVID at the beginning, there's much of it and a lot of it that is laudatory, period. But then you have the hangover of what was happening in the schools and then what happened to the economy that, as you pointed out long ago, David, was what voters were reacting to. In the timeline of history, you might have a fuller picture of the COVID response, and he might fare better from that evaluation.
Emily, inflation is the mind killer for every politician. Like it is, there's no politician who's come out of an inflationary event that I can think of with their reputation, their popularity intact. Inflation is just devastating. Jimmy Carter being the number one example in recent American history. But that's not the only problem of the Biden presidency. There was the surge in migration, which was not handled great. Obviously, what John was talking about in COVID, the Afghanistan withdrawal, which I continue to think was the right thing to do, but obviously was not optically was not delightful.
Well, and that's
Gaza.
where Biden's approval rating sunk and they never came back, right?
Yeah. There's Gaza and his obviously compromised mental state.
Right.
So was it like he was done in by a right-wing media that just pounded him, or was it like actually, if you add it all up, it is totally understandable why voters were so frustrated, and they would have been frustrated even if there was no Fox News to frustrate them.
I mean, I think both, right? Like certainly Fox News compounded all of those problems and maybe exaggerated them. But, one thing I was thinking about in listening or reading some of the like Biden legacy think pieces, which, as John was saying, it's a little early for all of that to really know, I think. But one of the questions that's lingering or asked is about the vigor of the presidency. Like, was the problem that, Biden didn't mount a strong enough argument and pitch and explanation for all this money that all these bills that he'd passed for like really getting people to understand what his vision of the economy was, how it was different from the Clinton Obama visions. If, you think that neoliberal way of seeing the world and dealing with the economy is bad, like, did he ever articulate all of that? Was he out there? All of those questions go back to, well, when was it that he was not, fully really present in the presidency, at least like every single day? And we have this pretty damning reporting from the Wall Street Journal that, this idea of the president having good days and bad days dates back to 2021. And that makes me wonder about like how much to factor all of this into my thinking about the problems that were evident. John, what do you think?
What you guys were saying earlier is true. A president can't talk their way out of the way people feel. That's your point about inflation, David. It just can't be done. And yes, he was, not out there on the road talking about his achievements as much as he could have been. And he was he was not accessible and available as a president the way we've come to expect presidents to be. That can be a key benefit to a presidency, right? Keeps the eye on the ball. And that was, in fact, partially, you could argue, why he was successful in getting elected in 2016. He wasn't, and his campaign wasn't consumed by the online world. It had its eye focused on the ball, and that helped him get elected in 2020. I said 2016, but I meant 2020. So it's not necessarily a damning quality that you're not out there selling all the time, because you can't be that effective. If the country feels what it feels, you can't change its mind and turn it around. To me, though, what the Wall Street Journal reporting you're talking about, Emily, and the fact that it was evident in the way he behaved in front of the camera is it links up to sort of a unified problem theory of his presidency, which links to what you were saying, David, which is he underappreciated the weakness of the Afghan government and the strength of the Taliban, even after 20 years of intelligence agencies underappreciating the rise of ISIS and other things. And somehow that lesson was not learned in the way he approached the withdrawal, fine to withdrawal, but there seemed to have been an underappreciation and a misjudgment on Afghanistan and the way the withdrawal would go. He underestimated the strength of the pull of immigration from his policies, which they then later came to admit in his presidency. They said this notion of a pull factor from U.S. policies was overstated. And then he underestimated the political damage of the migrant flows. He underestimated the virulence of inflation. And so you can stack those things up and see a through line and say, these were underestimations, which is distinct, say, on the inflation front from, I think history will wrestle with framing inflation under Biden, first of all, in the international context, second of all, in the how much control does a president really have over inflation context, third of all, when you're talking about the price of eggs, that had to do with lots of things that a president really has no control over, like avian flu. But the main puzzle in the economy is he made a call, which was inflation, and the risk of it was worse than having massive unemployment, which history might look on as the kind of tough decision a president has to make. And between two bad options, he chose the less bad option. That does not excuse, however, the lateness on recognizing the virulence of inflation, both as a reality and as a political matter. So if you draw that through line of being slow to recognize, then you attach it to the physical, basically, misinformation about his health and his capacity, that syncs up with that idea. And so you have a unified theory of the Biden presidency that's not great for him.
Yeah. And then also these questions about like, did the staffing go in this like too progressive direction and Biden didn't really notice that or harness it or rein it in because it's not really in sync with his own moderate instincts? Like that also fits into it's a question I have that fits into the picture you're painting.
And the age thing may be worse than we know, which will come out in history's time as well. So it's not like history is going to be all rainbows for the Biden presidency. On the other hand, Ukraine and China, it's undoubtedly the case that we're going to find that there was some really grim moment. And I think we already sort of know some of this about Putin's nuclear threats. There are undoubtedly moments in the Ukraine process which Biden managed and relied on and I think gets high marks across the board on for managing Europe, NATO, Russia, Ukraine, and managing it well. And I bet there are moments that were even more dangerous than we know. And there's also that question on China. Was there a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes on China? When you think of a presidency in the totality, yes, he should have done X, Y, and Z. But if you suddenly know that 3/4 of his day was taken up with the fact that China was about to invade Taiwan, I'm making this up, that we have no reporting of that, but you get my point. Some secret thing happening on China, you then recognize, okay, this is what the full thing going on in the presidency was. Finally, though, on China, man, if you listen to what Christopher Wray said to Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes about how thoroughly the Chinese are embedded inside of U.S. infrastructure, having that happen on your watch is one of those historic possible time bombs that you really don't want.
I missed that. Don't give me details. I don't want the details. I mean, I think because Jimmy Carter's death, Biden's departure from the presidency follows so quickly on the heels of Jimmy Carter's death, I think looking at the parallels is something we're all doing. And also the way that this Gaza ceasefire has come at the very last minute of the Biden presidency, but with Trump pushing, Trump grabbing credit for it in the same way that I feel like it has so many echoes of the end of the hostage crisis with Iran in 1981. It makes you sort of think about Biden and Carter. And I do feel like that one of the problems that Biden is going to have for history is that he's not going to have, the way Carter did, 50 years, 40 years to work off his poor exit. He isn't going to have a chance to do something else that is going to make us think of him in a different way. He will leave and he will be remembered as he left. He will not be remembered with 40 years of building houses, habitating for humanity. And also I think he will, even though of course he is an antidote to Trumpism, I think he will be historically held responsible in some sense for being weakly unable to prevent it, for being unable to stop its advance when he had this moment in 2021. I don't know whether that's a fair criticism, but I just looking at history books. I mean, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland. No one knows who Benjamin Harrison is. A lot of people know who Grover Cleveland is. It's
a fascinating question because Carter suffered.
Emily like, I don't know who Grover Cleveland is. Yeah, no one knows who Grover Cleveland is either.
Sure, you know Grover the
I live in Cleveland Park, which is named after Grover Cleveland.
No, of course you know Grover Cleveland. So a couple of things that are interesting about that to me is one, Carter suffered from the fact that Reagan was a popular president. And so Joe Biden in the end may benefit from what he benefited from in getting elected in 2020, which is to say Donald Trump. If the Trump second term is a huge success and he emerges as a highly popular president, that's not so good for Joe Biden. If Trump reminds people in office of what they didn't like about him when they elected him out, or I should say didn't reelect him in 2020, because talking about electing someone out is actually not the way humans talk in the world. That might actually, serve to Biden's benefit if that's coming along at the time. Many of these things are kicking in, not only on infrastructure and climate, but also the CHIPS Act. I mean, moving in a bipartisan way and restoring bipartisan legislation in the American system is no small feat. Now, that's hard to remember in the moment, but in 20 years, if Trump ends his second term the way his first term ended, maybe Biden looks better without actually having to do anything at all. So that would be the counter argument to that. And one thing that interested me, though, about going back and looking at Cleveland. So Cleveland comes into office his second term. It's all going to be wonderful. And then immediately there is the biggest depression in the United States in its history in 1893. So in other words, you come into the presidency and you think you've got experience for the job and like you got some things you want to do. And then it was just completely sidetracked by what was then a massive depression. So surprises can happen.
Let us go to cocktail chatter. I didn't know this, that there are non-alcoholic spirits, that there are basically versions of alcohol, of whiskey and gin that are non-alcoholic. I'm not exactly sure what they are, what they taste like, or how good they are. But as I've said incessantly, because people in dry January just talk about their dry January. That's all they do.
Incessantly talking about
it's so tedious. It's so tedious.
Let me tell you about my.
It's so tedious. And also, Also, if I'm having this much trouble and talk this much about not drinking in January, and I barely drink, I cannot even imagine what Pete Hegseth is going through. Just no offense.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So wait, I'm unclear on what's irritating you. The fact that you're going through dry January, or the fact that people are always talking about their dry January the way they used to talk about CrossFit?
I think he's confessing that his own talking about it constantly is.
I am talking about it I'm CrossFitting dry January. I'm bored with myself. Also, I would like a drink. And I realized I just made I'm going to Boston this weekend. I have 2 drinks. I made a date for 2 drinks. I'm like, but what am I going to drink? Anyway.
A mocktail. Mocktails are getting better and better.
With non-alcoholic spirits. Emily, what is your mocktail chatter?
Oh, I thought that was your chatter. Oh,
No.
I thought that was going somewhere.
This late in the show, you have the hope that something's going somewhere.
I don't know why. I have 2 chatters. So one is I really did find this book, The Safekeep, that I did Gabfest Reads episode about, just like a haunting mystery. So I don't want to say anything else about it, but it's short, it's delightful and immersive.
Adding to the list right now.
Read it and then listen to the interview I did with Yael if you're inclined, because she is wonderful in discussing it. My other chatter is about a TV series that I've been watching. I just discovered it's from 2009, but I'm going to plug it anyway. It's called A French Village, Un Village Français.
Oh, I've heard that's
French.
Great.
And it's great. It's about the Nazis coming into a fictional French village. I think it's 1941. And what happens to the village, like how everybody deals with this occupation, the relationships among the people in the village, who's playing what role, what the Nazis do. So far, I really like it. So, A French Village television show. Well, it's in French.
Bon. Jean Valjean. What is your mocktail chatter?
My mocktail chatter is
going to Les Miserables.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
My cocktail chatter is it was a hodgepodge. The first is that John Glenn sent in a YouTube link to Doc Ellis. Remember when I talked about the Doc Ellis cocktail, and that led me to the history of Doc Ellis, who claims that he pitched a no-hitter while on LSD. He was interviewed about this and gives a very funny interview, and then somebody turned it into a cartoon. So we'll post the link. It's quite amusing the way both he describes it and then the cartoon accompaniment. I would also like to thank Parker Donham. Parker suggested Scott and Bailey, which is another UK procedural, and it's about 2 women, and it's very good and also really smart in the way it's written, and sort of plays with some of the typical male tropes about procedurals, but has these 3 really great women characters. Anyway, it's great fun. But the real cocktail chatter is something that you guys probably already know, because you are absolutely neck deep in the zeitgeist, plus you just kind of know about these things. But we are in a cottage cheese renaissance, which if you grew up in the era that we did, cottage cheese was maybe this wasn't your experience, but it was like a punishment that people would go. You would go to someone's house and their the way we grew up, their mother would serve cottage cheese, or there would be some person eating alone in the drugstore diner, eating cottage cheese with a Dole pineapple ring on the top, and it was just
canned
awful.
Pineapple, inevitably.
Canned pineapple, yes, exactly. But now, cottage cheese is being eaten by influencers, and it's a massive part of protein-heavy diets. 50%
Is it
sales
better?
have increased.
Does it taste better?
I don't know, but sales have increased 50% over the last 5 years.
I don't know whether it tastes better. It was never good.
It's really proteinaceous. I went through a 1 week cottage cheese phase.
Word? Excuse me.
I don't know.
Okay,
it's proteinaceous. It's got a lot of protein. And it has the quality. It's sort of like, it's burrata. It's like burrata, that mozzarella thing, which is this mix of burrata. Kind of creamy and
it doesn't taste like burrata, or it didn't in the 1980s, which is the last time I had it.
But it's not like burrata. It's like a really. If you were on a desert island and someone said you can have this, you'd be like, oh, it's kind of like burrata, but it's not good. But it's not good. But it isn't good. But it would be so amazing if it became good. If they've now got good versions of it.
Why does it have more protein than yogurt? Does it?
I don't know.
Those clumps. But anyway, proteinaceous is a word. First of all, to nail that one down. Proteinaceous is a word. Am I back?
Really? Huh. Look,
Am I
David
back?
looks very smug now.
Yeah. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back. You're back. Oh, I'm just looking smugly at Emily. I'm looking smugly at Emily because proteinaceous is a word. No, leave this in. Leave this part in. This is great.
No, absolutely. It's a very proteinaceous exchange. But what I want to say is, did the pretentious move towards burrata, which we all engaged in, which was like basically it's mozzarella cheese, but we everybody wants to have their burrata. That kind of put people in a position to reassess cottage cheese.
Yeah, maybe so. It's burrata, mozzarella, but with cream, and cottage cheese is like rubbery bits of cheese with slightly slimy bits of cheese, and that makes them very similar. All right, I'm gonna move us along. My chatter, even though I apparently had one already. Another topic, in addition to Dry January, another topic about which people are tediously long-winded and boring is Saturday Night Live. There is like as much content about Saturday Night Live as there is actual Saturday Night Live. There these. Especially for its 50th anniversary, which is this year, just the number of books and movies and oral histories, you kind of can't stand it. And it's a show I no longer watch, although I'm sure it's brilliant, but it clearly changed comedy. It changed the culture. It formed the constellation of the Hollywood star system for comedy. And there's a fantastic profile of Lorne Michaels in The New Yorker by Susan Morrison, who the creator of Saturday Night Live, and for its 50 years, or almost all of its 50 years, the presiding genius and the decider of it all. And it's about how he runs the show, his particular genius, his ability to find and make stars, and then to let go of stars. It's how something that seems so mysterious, which is the kind of coming together, this formation of this comedy magic that happens, how it is the work of this person who acts deliberately, although a lot of his work seems to be unconscious, but she's very good at sort of capturing how it all hangs together. And it's fascinating. Really, I love reading anything about how people do their jobs. And this is a really fantastic entry in that genre, this article in The New Yorker about Lorne Michaels. Listeners, you have chatters for us. Please keep them coming. Please email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. Something that you're chattering about with your folks. And our listener chatter this week comes from Joe.
Hi, my name is Joe from Haddon Township, New Jersey. My listener chatter is thelotradio.com. It's live streaming audio and video of DJs spinning electronic dance music all day and all night. They're in a shipping container parked somewhere in Brooklyn, of course. The fisheye camera lens gives you a clear view of everything. The DJs, the turntables and other gadgets, the bench at the back of the room where groupies sometimes gather, the completely sticker-encrusted walls and ceiling. The variety of sounds and styles is astonishing. You can just use it as background music, but it's mesmerizing and somehow very comforting to check in on the real person making sounds right before your eyes. Check it out.
That's all for our episode this week, but we also have a bonus episode in your feed. We're going to talk about the politics of the LA fires, how they've been politicized and whether that makes sense. That's only for Slate Plus members, however. Slate Plus members get so much great stuff for their subscription. In addition to our bonus episodes, they get bonus episodes of other Slate podcasts. They get discounts to live shows, and they never hit the paywall at the Slate site. So if you are a member, thank you. Enjoy it. If you're not a member, you can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or go to slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's all for our show today. The Gabfest is produced by Cheyna Roth. Our researcher for just a couple more weeks is Julie Huygen. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is the VP of Audio for Slate, but I think it's her last week at Slate, and so we will miss Alicia. She's been a great colleague.
Thank you, Alicia.
We wish you so well.
And you've been, it's been really fun working with you, Alicia. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson and David Plotz, thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week.
It's still an article.
It's still an article. Same book. Now book is in my head. Book is in my head. It is still an article in the New Yorker.